I speak now not as a teacher, but as a soul under discipline. I have fled the noise of the world not because it is wicked, but because it is loud. The marketplace clamors, the court debates. The streets overflow with opinion, with rumor, with the urgency of things that will be forgotten by morning. Here, within these walls of stone, nothing distracts the mind except itself. And that is enough. That is more than enough. I did not come to this place to invent a doctrine. I came to still my thoughts, to quiet the endless churning that turns knowledge into noise. But the more I stilled them, the more they pressed inward, as water presses against a dam. The silence I sought became not emptiness, but fullness. For the mind cannot remain idle. If it is not ordered toward truth, it turns upon itself, it invents phantoms, it chases shadows, it builds elaborate castles upon foundations of air. So I resolved to give it one task, not many, not endless disputations, not 1,000 questions that multiply like weeds, but one. To understand what I believe, not to replace faith, but to honor it. Not to dissect the mystery, but to approach it with the dignity it deserves. I believe in God. This belief was given to me before I could reason, before I could doubt, before I could choose. It came with my mother's prayers, with the bells at dawn, with the bread broken at table. It was woven into the fabric of my days before I knew what fabric was, before I knew what days were. But belief that remains unexamined is like a seed left in a jar. Alive, perhaps, protected, certainly, but never grown, never tested by soil, never reached toward light. So I asked myself a question that frightened me by its simplicity. What must God be, if God truly is God? Not what poets say, with their golden metaphors and their convenient visions. Not what fear imagines, conjuring a tyrant in the clouds, a cosmic accountant of sins. Not what power desires, shaping divinity in the image of earthly thrones. What must God be by necessity, by the very nature of being itself? I withdrew from books. I withdrew from voices. We withdrew even from argument, from the comfort of familiar objections and rehearsed replies, and I turned inward to that silent chamber where thought meets being, where the soul stands naked before truth. For whatever can be known must be known by a mind. There is no knowing without a knower. There is no truth that does not address itself to understanding. If God is unknowable in every way, then even that statement is already knowledge, already a claim about God, already a bridge between the human and the divine. So complete unknowability defeats itself. I followed thought to its furthest edge, to the place where certainty trembles before mystery, but does not collapse into nonsense. He observed how the mind judges. We say one thing is better than another. We say one action is more just, one intention more pure, one truth more profound. Every day, in 1,000 ways, we make comparisons. We choose. We prefer. We recognize hierarchy in value. But how do we know this? Where is the scale? Where is the measure? Not in the objects themselves, for they vary. What seems good to one appears evil to another. Not in custom, for customs conflict. What one age honors, another burns. Not in authority alone, for authorities err, kings fall, councils contradict. Even the wise disagree. The measure exists only in the intellect, and yet it exceeds any particular intellect. For every mind can conceive of something greater than what it presently knows. The prisoner dreams of freedom. The sick long for health. The foolish aspire to wisdom. This reaching is universal. It cannot be trained away. It cannot be suppressed by doctrine or silenced by decree. Even despair measures itself against hope. Even hatred knows it falls short of love. And so I gave this reaching a name. Not a name of sound, but of meaning. Not a label to capture, but a direction to point. That in which nothing greater can be conceived. I did not say this lightly. I tested every word as a jeweler tests gold, turning it in different lights, striking it to hear its ring. Not the greatest thing, for numbers may increase. There is no largest number, no final sum. Not the most powerful, for power can corrupt. Raw force is not greatness. Dominion is not excellence. Not the perfect being, for perfection implies measurement against a standard outside itself, but that than which nothing greater can be conceived. A limit, a horizon. A boundary the mind cannot cross without contradiction, without undoing the very act of thought itself. Even the one who denies God cannot deny this concept. Let him sit in his study and declare the heavens empty. Let him write treatises proving absence. But when he hears this phrase, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, he understands what is meant. The words enter his mind and take up residence there, whether he wills it or not. And what is understood exists, at least in the understanding. This is not a trick. This is not wordplay. This is the simplest acknowledgement of how meaning works, how thought operates. To understand a concept is to give it a kind of being, not full being, perhaps not the being of mountains and rivers, but mental being, intentional being, the being of an idea. But existence only in the understanding is lesser than existence in both understanding and reality. This is not theology. This is comparison. This is observation. A painting imagined is not greater than a real painting. The one I can see, the one I can touch, surpasses the one I merely dream. A cure conceived is not greater than a cure administered. The medicine in the bottle saves lives the theory cannot. A friend hoped for is not greater than a friend present. Flesh and voice and laughter exceed the phantom of longing. Therefore, a God existing only in thought is not greater than a God existing in truth. Now attend carefully. Follow the thread. Do not let prejudice snap what logic has woven. If that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists only in the understanding, then something greater can be conceived, namely, the same being existing in reality. For real existence adds to greatness. Being in truth surpasses being in thought alone. But this contradicts the very definition we began with. We said nothing greater can be conceived, yet now we have conceived something greater. The definition has destroyed itself. Therefore, that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist in reality, not as possibility, not as probability, but as necessity. This is not faith speaking. This is necessity revealing itself, the mind discovering what it cannot unknow. And yet, my soul was not satisfied, for many things exist. Stones exist, scattered across the hillside. Beasts exist, moving through forest and field. Men exist, building and destroying, loving and hating, rising and falling. Existence alone does not make God. Existence is cheap. Existence is common. Existence is the currency of gnats and dust. So he pressed further. I looked more closely at the nature of existence itself. There are things that exist but could fail to exist. They begin, they end, they depend. The mountain depends on the earth. The flame depends on wood. The thought depends on the thinker. Such existence is fragile, held together by conditions, threatened by change, always one step from collapse. But the greatest conceivable being cannot depend on anything else. For that which depends is lesser than that which does not. The servant is lesser than the master. The effect is lesser than the cause. The sustained is lesser than the sustainer. Therefore God must exist in such a way that non-existence is impossible. Not difficult, not unlikely, impossible. God exists, necessarily, not by force, for force is external, and God has no exterior. Not by decree, for decree implies a decreer prior to the decree, but by the impossibility of the contrary, by the internal logic of being itself. To say God does not exist is not merely false, it is incoherent, a statement that undoes itself, a square circle, a number greater than infinity. Here the mind begins to tremble, for necessary existence is not like ours. We exist because something caused us, parents, nature, and the chain of being. We exist because something sustains us, food, breath, the laws of physics. We exist because time allows us, this moment, this hour, this fragile now. But God does not exist within time. Time exists because God exists. Time is not God's container, but God's creation. God does not endure. Endurance implies passage, succession, and the movement from one state to another. God does not wait. God does not progress. God does not become. God is. Pure, complete, eternal being, not eternal in the sense of infinite duration, for even that would be temporal, but eternal as the ground of duration itself, as the source from which all moments flow. From this necessity flows simplicity. Watch carefully, for here the intellect performs its most difficult work. Anything composed of parts can be undone. The house can be dismantled. The body can decay. The argument can be refuted. Anything that can be undone is not greatest, for it contains within itself the seed of its own destruction. Therefore God is not composed. Not of body, for bodies are extended in space, divisible and changeable. Not of matter, for matter requires form, and form implies composition. Not even of attributes as we possess them. We have wisdom. We possess it. Like a coat we might remove. We gain it, we lose it. It increases and decreases. But God does not have goodness. God is goodness. God does not possess wisdom. God is wisdom. God does not contain justice. God is justice. In God, there is no gap between what is and what ought to be. No distance between being and perfection. To be is to be perfect. Now consider justice. We call some actions just, others unjust. We craft laws, we establish courts, we weigh evidence, we render verdicts. But our judgments vary. What seemed just yesterday appears harsh today. What one nation applauds, another condemns. Our punishments err too severe or too lenient, missing the mark in one direction or another. Our mercy falters, we forgive what should be corrected, we condemn what should be pardoned. Yet, we still speak as though justice itself were real, as though there were a true north by which all our compasses are calibrated or found wanting. What is justice if not conformity to the highest good? And what is the highest good if not good? Therefore justice is not something outside God, not a law God consults, not a standard God obeys. Justice is God understood as order, as the right relation of all things to their proper end. And mercy? Here the heart rebels. Here even the faithful stumble. For mercy seems to suspend justice. It seems to say the law applied, but we will not apply it. The debt is owed, but we will not collect it. And justice seems to forbid mercy. It seems to demand let what is owed be paid in full, let no crime go unanswered, let the balance be exact. How can both be perfect in one being? How can God be perfectly just and perfectly merciful without contradiction? This troubled me deeply. I turned it over in my mind like a jeweler, examining a flaw that might shatter the entire stone. Until I understood justice punishes sin because sin is disorder, because it tears the fabric of right relation, because it wounds being itself. Mercy forgives sin not by ignoring the wound, but by healing it, by restoring what was broken, by paying what justice demands. But forgiveness that ignores justice is indulgence, not mercy. It is sentimentality, the coward's refusal to name evil for what it is. And punishment that ignores mercy is cruelty, not justice. It is vengeance, the proud heart's desire for destruction rather than restoration. In God, justice is satisfied through mercy, not by overlooking sin, but by overcoming it. Not by pretending the debt doesn't exist, but by paying it from divine abundance. Here the incarnation begins to make sense, not as mythology, not as cosmic theater, but as the logical outworking of justice and mercy unified. Here the intellect reaches its limit, not because the thought is false, but because it is too rich, too dense with meaning for the finite mind to hold entire. It grasps it for a moment and then it slips, not into error but into mystery. He had been accused of arrogance, of attempting to trap God in syllogisms, to reduce the infinite to propositions, to domesticate the wild holiness that shatters all our categories. I answer, I have trapped nothing. I have only followed thought where it cannot escape itself. I have only observed what the mind cannot avoid knowing once it begins to think clearly. If God is truth, then reason cannot flee him. Every act of reasoning participates in divine logos. Every coherent thought echoes the eternal word. If God is light, then thinking cannot avoid illumination. To think truly is already to be in God's presence, whether we acknowledge it or not. He did not reason to escape faith. I did not take up logic as a weapon against mystery. I reasoned because faith demanded it, because authentic belief does not fear understanding, because love desires to know what it loves. For faith that forbids inquiry is not faith, it is fear, the frightened clutching at formulas and slogans, the refusal to let God be greater than our small certainties. And reason that forbids worship is not reason, it is pride, the refusal to acknowledge that thinking itself is a gift from what exceeds thought. Now I confess, I do not see God, I do not contain God, I do not master God. My understanding is not possession. My arguments are not chains. My syllogisms are not cages. But I see that God must be. I see it with the clarity of mathematical proof, with the necessity of logical demonstration. And knowing this, I know also that my knowing is small. This is not defeat. This is not the collapse of the intellectual project. It is humility born of clarity, the recognition that to prove God's existence is not to exhaust God's nature, that to demonstrate necessity is not to eliminate mystery. The argument points beyond itself like a finger indicating the moon, and only a fool would mistake the finger for the light. So I pray, not for visions that would overwhelm discernment, not for signs that would replace faith with certainty, but for understanding. That I may understand what I believe not fully, for that is impossible, but truly in proportion to my capacity. Unbelieving, I may love, for knowledge kindles affection, understanding deepens devotion, and loving, I may rest, not in the torpor of satisfaction, but in the peace of right desire, the soul settling into its proper home. For you, O Lord, are not merely that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, though you are certainly that, and my argument stands, and the necessity holds. You are that without which nothing can be conceived at all. You are the light by which we see, the ground on which we stand, the air we breathe while breathing, the being that makes being possible. To deny you is not simply to be wrong, it is to saw off the branch on which thought itself sits, to arrest the very possibility of truth, of meaning, of the connection between mind and world. And so I end where I began, not in the noise of the world, but in the silence where truth speaks. Not in the conclusions I have reached, but in the one who makes reaching possible. Not in the triumph of argument, but in the submission of wonder. Let those who will dispute my reasoning. Let them find the flaw, expose the error, unravel the thread. I welcome it, for if my argument is false, I wish to know, and if it is true, it will survive every test. But whether my proof stands or falls, this I know, I sought God with my mind because I had already found God with my heart, and the finding preceded the seeking. The love came before the logic. The worship made the wondering possible. This is the strange truth of the examined faith. We reason toward God because God has already reasoned toward us. We reach for understanding because understanding itself has taken hold of us, has claimed us, and called us by name. And in that calling, in that claiming, in that mysterious election of the soul by truth, there is the real proof, the one beyond all arguments, the one that cannot be demonstrated but only experienced, only lived, only loved. Fides coherens intellectum, faith seeking understanding, not faith becoming understanding, not faith replaced by understanding, but faith reaching, striving, asking, knocking, and finding that the door was open all along.